The rain over the Blue Ridge Mountains did not fall so much as it executed a hostile takeover of the asphalt. It was a localized deluge, a curtain of slate-gray water that turned the winding North Carolina highway into a slick, treacherous ribbon. Victoria gripped the handlebars of the vintage Indian Scout, the soaked leather of her gloves offering little purchase. The cold had long since penetrated her designer riding jacket, settling into her bones, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the deafening roar of the life she was leaving behind. Her mind, usually a pristine architecture of data points, risk assessments, and quarterly projections, was currently a shattered mosaic. The digital tether in her inner pocket vibrated with the relentless urgency of a dying heartbeat. It was the board of directors. It was Harrison. It was the multi-billion-dollar analytics empire she had built from a cramped dorm room in Austin. Now closing its jaws around her throat, she pulled the heavy motorcycle onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching loudly against the storm's percussion. The engine idled, a deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through her boots. She killed the ignition. The sudden mechanical silence was swallowed instantly by the roaring wind. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the waterproof zipper of her jacket, extracting the sleek, custom-encrypted smartphone. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of notifications. Urgent, critical, escalation. Harrison's name appeared over and over, demanding her presence, demanding her compliance, demanding the merger she knew would gut the very soul of her company. Beside the glowing screen, catching the dim ambient light, was the diamond on her left hand. Flawless, cold, heavy. Harrison had placed it there 3 weeks ago in a calculated move of corporate synergy masquerading as romance. It was a shackle forged in platinum. A rusted, overflowing trash barrel stood beside a weathered mile marker. Victoria stared at it. The rain plastered her dark hair to her face, stinging her cheeks. Her hand moved before the logical centers of her brain could calculate the risk. The ring slid off her damp finger with terrifying ease. It pinged sharply against the metal rim of the barrel, before vanishing into the wet garbage. The phone followed, a heavy, satisfying splash. The immediate aftermath was an echoing void. For a decade, Victoria's worth had been measured in nanoseconds, in market capitalization, in the constant, manic stream of information. Now, there was only the smell of wet pine and the violent chill of the mountain air. She was a ghost. She swung her leg back over the Indian Scout, hitting the starter. The engine coughed, a pathetic, sputtering rattle that died immediately. Her thumb pressed harder. Another hollow click. The electrical system, perhaps compromised by the sudden altitude change and the relentless moisture, had simply given up. The machine had surrendered. Victoria sat in the downpour, the irony thick enough to choke on. The woman who controlled the data flow of half the western seaboard was stranded on a nameless stretch of mountain road, entirely powerless. She pushed the dead weight of the motorcycle through the mud, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The physical exertion was foreign, a brutal contrast to the ergonomic perfection of her 38th floor office. Every muscle in her back screamed in protest. Through the sheet of rain, a faint flickering light bled into the gloom. A neon sign, missing 2 letters, buzzed violently against the side of a low, cinder-block building. JCSNCSOM, Jackson Custom. She shoved the heavy bike toward the puddle-choked driveway. The garage door was half open, spilling warm, golden light onto the cracked concrete. The air inside smelled of cedar shavings, heavy motor oil, and the sharp tang of hot metal. It was an environment of absolute, unapologetic reality. She left the motorcycle leaning heavily on its kickstand just beneath the overhang and stepped into the bay. The sharp metallic clang of a wrench hitting a steel workbench echoed through the cavernous space. Jackson stood beneath the harsh glare of a halogen work light. He was a man carved from the very elements of his trade, tall and broad-shouldered, his deep, rich skin gleaming with a thin sheen of sweat and grease. His forearms, corded with muscle, were smeared with carbon dust. He wore a faded thermal Henley and heavy denim, an imposing figure of quiet, kinetic energy. He did not look up immediately. His attention was fiercely anchored to the exposed engine block of a rusted Chevy truck. His hands moved with an almost surgical precision, devoid of wasted motion. In the corner of the shop, safely barricaded behind a wall of stacked tires, sat a small wooden desk. A little girl with a halo of dark, tightly coiled hair was hunched over a scatter of crayons. She was drawing with intense, furious dedication, completely unbothered by the metallic cacophony of the garage. Victoria stood in the threshold, shivering violently, a pool of rainwater forming around her expensive boots. She was accustomed to commanding the immediate attention of entire boardrooms the second she cleared a doorway. Here she was merely a draft of cold air. Jackson finally wiped his hands slowly on a red shop rag, his gaze lifting. His eyes were dark, steady, and utterly unimpressed by the tailored cut of her soaked jacket or the haughty lift of her chin. He looked past her, assessing the drenched Indian scout in the driveway. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to resonate from the concrete floor. "You shouldn't be riding a carbureted twin in this kind of weather. The moisture displacement is too high." Victoria crossed her arms, trying to suppress her shivering. "I didn't consult a meteorological data model before I left. It died. I need it fixed. Now." Jackson's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He tossed the rag onto the bench. He did not jump to attention. He did not ask for a credit card. He walked with a deliberate, unhurried, heavy stride past her, stepping out into the freezing rain. He crouched beside the motorcycle, his large hands tracing the fuel lines, tapping the casing with a practiced rhythm. He was reading the machine, diagnosing its ailments through touch and sound, completely ignoring the billionaire tapping her foot impatiently behind him. The little girl at the desk looked up, her eyes wide and observant, locked onto Victoria. The child's voice was bright, piercing through the heavy atmosphere. "My dad says machines break when people stop paying attention to them. People are the same way." Victoria froze. The words struck her with the precision of a sniper's bullet, echoing the hollow, empty corridors of her own life. She stared at the 7-year-old, entirely unnerved by the accidental wisdom. Jackson returned, pushing the heavy motorcycle backward into the dry bay with effortless strength. He locked the kickstand in place and grabbed a diagnostic light. His attention remained firmly on the cold engine. "Stator's shot. Ignition coil is flooded. It's not a quick fix. You're looking at 2 days minimum waiting on parts from Charlotte." Victoria's mind instantly began calculating alternatives. Car services, flights, but her phone was at the bottom of a trash can miles away. "I don't have 2 days. I'll pay double your usual rate to expedite it." Jackson met her gaze for the first time. The intensity in his dark eyes forced her to take a half step back. "Double of nothing is still nothing. I can't magically conjure a stator out of thin air just because you're in a hurry. The world doesn't spin on your schedule in this shop." The reprimand stung. It was blunt, factual, and completely devoid of the groveling she was used to. The little girl slid off her stool, marching over with a heavy woolen blanket dragged from a chair. She held it out to Victoria. "You're making a puddle. I'm Chloe. You look like you need a hot chocolate." Victoria looked down at the child, then at the blanket. Her defensive walls, fortified by years of corporate warfare, wared slightly in the face of absolute, uncalculated kindness. She took the blanket, wrapping it around her shivering shoulders. Her voice lost its sharp edge. "Thank you. I'm Claire." The lie slipped out with practiced ease. Victoria, the ruthless CEO, could not exist here. Claire, an anonymous traveler fleeing a bad situation, was safe. Jackson pointed toward a cramped office enclosed in frosted glass at the back of the bay. "There's a space heater in there. Sit down before you catch pneumonia. I'll start stripping the housing." The first night was a blur of exhaustion. Victoria slept on a worn leather sofa in the back office, the rhythmic clinking of Jackson's tools lulling her into a deep, dreamless state. When she woke, the morning sun was cutting brutal shafts of light through the grimy high windows. Her clothes had dried into stiff, uncomfortable armor. The smell of the shop had settled onto her skin. She walked out into the bay. Jackson was already there, or perhaps he had never left. He was wiping down the freshly cleaned carburetor of her Indian Scout. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She needed transportation. She needed to secure lodging. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket, extracting her wallet. The sleek, heavy black card felt like a weapon in her hand. It was the master key to the world. She walked up to the workbench, placing the card on the scarred steel surface. Her tone was brisk, reclaiming her usual authority. "I need to secure a rental vehicle while I wait. There must be an enterprise or a local agency in town. Run a $1,000 retainer on this for the repairs and tell me where the nearest hotel is." Jackson looked at the card, then at her. He wiped his hands, walking over to an ancient, heavy-duty card reader connected to a dusty computer terminal. He swiped the black plastic, the machine word processing. A sharp, angry beep echoed in the quiet shop. Jackson frowned, typing a sequence of keys. He swiped it again. Another beep. He turned the monitor toward her. The pixelated red letters screamed their verdict across the screen. "Declined. Account frozen." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her boots. She stared at the screen, her analytical mind immediately tracing the vector of the attack. Harrison. He hadn't just reported her missing. He had initiated a hostile protocol. As the chief strategy officer, he had the emergency authorization to freeze her personal assets under the guise of an executive disappearance clause. A poison pill she herself had written into the corporate bylaws to prevent kidnapping ransoms. He was using her own brilliant paranoia against her. She was entirely cut off. No phone, no cash, no access to the billions sitting in decentralized accounts across the globe. She was standing in a dusty garage in a town she didn't know the name of, possessing nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken motorcycle. Jackson watched the color drain from her face. He ejected the card and tossed it onto the desk. His voice was devoid of pity but lacked its previous edge. "Looks like your plastic is just plastic today. You have anyone I can call for you?" Victoria gripped the edge of the workbench, her knuckles turning white. Calling Austin meant surrender. It meant Harrison had won. It meant walking back into the glass cage and letting them strip her company for parts. Her voice was barely a whisper. "No, there is no one." Jackson studied her. He saw the genuine panic beneath the tailored exterior. He was a man who understood the sudden, brutal shifts of fate. He had buried a wife and raised a daughter alone. He knew what the edge of the cliff looked like. He leaned against the tool chest, crossing his massive arms. "The parts for your bike are $200. My labor is $300. You owe me a night on that couch and you need to eat." Victoria straightened her spine, tapping into reserves of defiance she didn't know she possessed. "I will pay you. Every cent. The moment my bank clears this administrative error." Jackson shook his head slowly. "I don't run a tab. The bank doesn't take IOS when they come for my mortgage. But I need hands. My regular assistant walked out 2 days ago. The shop is a mess. The inventory is unlogged, and I have 3 engines that need degreasing before I can even look at them." Victoria stared at him, uncomprehending. The concept of manual labor was as foreign to her as quantum physics to a toddler. She built algorithms that shifted global supply chains. She did not clean grease. Her pride flared, hot and defensive. "You want me to clean your floors?" Jackson's expression hardened. The absolute, uncompromising dignity of the working man radiated from him. "I want you to earn your keep. A broom doesn't care what your name is, Claire. It just cares if you push it. You want a place to sleep and your bike fixed? You work. Otherwise, the highway is right outside. The silence stretched, heavy and tense. Victoria looked at his calloused hands, then down at her own manicured nails. The sheer absurdity of the situation threatened to crush her. But beneath the panic, a strange, terrifying thrill ignited. For the first time in a decade, a problem could not be solved by transferring funds or firing a subordinate. She reached out and took the heavy push broom leaning against the wall. The wooden handle was rough, polished smooth by years of friction. Her voice was cold, vibrating with suppressed tension. "Show me where the degreaser is." Jackson's eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by professional detachment. He pointed toward a row of chemical drums. "Don't mix the green bottle with the bleach unless you want to evacuate the block." For the next 10 hours, Victoria experienced the agonizing reality of physical labor. She scrubbed centuries of grime from engine casings, her arms trembling under the weight of the wire brushes. She reorganized shelves of heavy steel components, her mind instinctively creating efficiency models for the inventory, grouping parts by frequency of use and mechanical proximity. She watched Jackson work. He was a maestro of mechanical resurrection. He didn't just replace parts, he understood the holistic system of the machine. He listened to the pitch of a grinding gear, feeling the vibration through his fingertips. He worked with a silent, heavy grief that seemed to infuse everything he touched, pouring his soul into dead metal to bring it back to life. It was a stark contrast to her world, where value was extracted, packaged, and sold without a single drop of sweat hitting the floor. By the time the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the garage floor, Victoria was coated in a thin layer of particulate dust and dried oil. Every joint ached with a dull, persistent throb. She collapsed onto the metal stool next to Chloe's desk, her chest heaving. Jackson walked over, handing her a cold bottle of water and a wrapped sandwich from the deli down the street. He didn't offer a patronizing compliment. He simply acknowledged the effort. His voice was low, carrying a rough cadence. "You organize better than my last guy. He used to put the metric sockets with the standard, drove me crazy." Victoria unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers, taking a long drink. The cold water felt like a revelation. Her chest tightened as the words slipped out. "I like systems. Things should be where they belong." Jackson pulled up a stool opposite her, unwrapping his own meal. "And where do you belong, Claire? Because it sure isn't behind a push broom." The directness of the question made her flinch. She looked away, watching the dust motes dance in the fading light. "I used to think I knew. Now I'm just trying to pay off a stater." Chloe skipped over, holding up a drawing. It was a sprawling, chaotic map of an imaginary city complete with heavily fortified walls and a complex river system. The little girl pointed to a jagged structure in the center. "This is the castle. But the queen isn't there. She went on a secret mission." Victoria smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that felt alien on her face. She engaged with the child's logic. "Why did she leave the castle? Isn't it safe there?" Chloe shook her head seriously. "Castles are just fancy cages if you lock the doors from the inside." Jackson coughed softly into his hand, a rough sound masking a heavy sigh. He looked at his daughter with a mixture of overwhelming love and profound sadness. He was fiercely protective, a single father navigating the minefield of raising a bright, sensitive child in a world that had already taken her mother. He stood up, clearing the wrappers. "Bedtime, Bug. Pack up the kingdom." The next 48 hours established a grueling, rhythmic routine. Victoria woke up aching, drank bitter black coffee brewed in a stained glass pot, and went to work. She scrubbed, she lifted, she sorted. The physical exhaustion was a brutal anesthetic, silencing the screaming anxieties of her corporate life. She observed the ecosystem of the shop. Local truckers brought in rigs that were falling apart, and Jackson kept them on the road with salvaged parts and sheer willpower. He charged them a fraction of what a dealership would, often accepting bartered goods, a crate of fresh apples, a promise of electrical work on his house, when cash was short. He possessed an unyielding moral compass. A wealthy tourist from out of town brought in a perfectly fine Porsche, demanding an expensive engine overhaul because it sounded off. Jackson ran the diagnostics, found a loose heat shield, tightened a single bolt, and charged the man $20. When the tourist left, bewildered, Victoria had stopped sorting spark plugs. Her analytical mind recoiled. You could have billed him $2,000. He wouldn't have known the difference. He was begging you to take his money. Jackson didn't stop wiping down his tools. His voice was hard, vibrating with a deep-seated pride. A man who steals with a wrench is no different than a man who steals with a gun. My hands build things, they don't pick pockets. The day I start charging for ghosts is the day I lock those bay doors for good. Victoria felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. In her world, leveraging ignorance for maximum profit wasn't a crime. It was the foundation of the business model. She stared at Jackson's broad back, realizing that this grease-stained mechanic possessed a terrifying level of integrity. On the afternoon of the third day, the fragile sanctuary Victoria had built around herself nearly collapsed. She was crouched behind Chloe's desk, trying to pry a jammed drawer open to organize old invoices. Her sleeves were rolled up, her hair tied back in a messy knot with a piece of electrical wire. She reached her left arm deep into the recess of the desk. The movement pushed her sleeve back, exposing the heavy, brushed steel face of her satellite smartwatch. It was the only piece of tech she hadn't thrown away, primarily because the biometric clasp required a specific sequence to unlock, and she had forgotten it in her adrenaline-fueled escape. It was offline, disconnected from cellular networks, but the internal emergency reserves were still active. Suddenly, the watch vibrated violently against her wrist. It had caught a stray ping from a passing military or encrypted civilian satellite. The OLED screen flared to life, projecting a crisp, bright interface into the shadows under the desk. A backlog of critical emergency notifications flooded the tiny screen, followed immediately by her absolute fail-safe financial dashboard. The numbers glowed with radioactive intensity in the dim light. Reserve Fund Alpha, $45,250,000 US. Status, pending biometric override. Victoria lunged to cover the screen with her right hand, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A sharp intake of breath came from right beside her ear. She whipped her head around. Chloe was crouched beside her, her large, expressive eyes wide with absolute shock, staring directly at the glowing zeros illuminating Victoria's wrist. The air left Victoria's lungs. The lie was over. The child had just seen more money on a wrist-bound screen than this entire town generated in a decade. Jackson would know. He would know she had lied about being broke, lied about her identity, lied about everything. His fierce pride would not tolerate the deception. He would throw her out, and Harrison would find her. Victoria's mind scrambled for a containment protocol. She opened her mouth, ready to spin a desperate fabrication about glitching software or a simulated video game. Before she could speak, Chloe grabbed Victoria's wrist, pulling the sleeve down furiously to cover the watch face. The little girl looked over her shoulder toward the bay where Jackson was hammering a dent out of a fender, oblivious to the crisis under the desk. Chloe leaned in, her voice a fierce, hushed whisper. "Are you a spy?" Victoria blinked, completely derailed by the question. Chloe's eyes were shining with the thrill of espionage. "I saw a movie. The spy had a watch just like that with all the secret codes and the millions of dollars to buy helicopters. Are you hiding from the bad guys? Is that why your card didn't work, so they couldn't track you?" The innocence of the child's logic provided a miraculous, impossible escape route. Victoria stared into Chloe's earnest face. The urge to tell the truth fought a violent war against the instinct to survive. Survival won. Victoria swallowed hard, lowering her voice to match the child's conspiratorial tone. Yes, I am on a very important assignment, and I had to go completely dark. No one can know, Chloe. If the bad guys find out I have access to those codes, it would be dangerous. Chloe nodded solemnly, placing a small, grease-smudged hand over her heart. I swear, I won't tell Dad. He worries too much anyway. He's always trying to fix everything, but he can't fix bad guys. A profound, sickening wave of guilt washed over Victoria. She was exploiting the trust of a child to maintain a facade, but the relief was intoxicating. She squeezed Chloe's hand. Thank you. You're a brave girl. Chloe grinned, scurrying back to her crayons, invigorated by her new role as a guardian of state secrets. Victoria leaned her head back against the cold metal of the desk drawer, closing her eyes. She was a billionaire hiding in a garage, scrubbing engine grease to pay off a $200 repair, while a 7-year-old provided her cover story. The thud of heavy boots approaching made her snap her eyes open. Jackson stood towering over the desk, holding a greasy clipboard. He didn't look angry, but his presence was an undeniable physical force. He looked down at her, taking in her exhausted posture, the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the defensive tightness in her shoulders. His deep voice cut through the ambient noise of the shop. The stator arrived on the afternoon freight. I'll have it installed and the timing adjusted by noon tomorrow. You're free to go after that. The words should have brought relief, freedom, the end of the manual labor. But as Victoria looked up into his dark, perceptive eyes, a strange, terrifying realization seized her. She didn't want to leave. The realization was illogical. It defied every algorithm she had ever built. But sitting on the cold concrete, smelling of ozone and old oil, she felt a profound sense of gravity. In her glass tower in Austin, she was floating, disconnected, surrounded by people who only saw her as a vehicle for their own wealth. Here Jackson saw her as a worker. Chloe saw her as a hero. For the first time in her life, the machine of her existence had stopped moving fast enough for her to actually feel the gears turning. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, her voice steady, carrying a resolve that surprised her. Her chest tightened, the words slipping out with total conviction. I noticed the intake valves on the flathead Ford in the corner are completely carbonized. It's going to take you 3 days to hand clean them if you want to save the original block. Jackson's brow furrowed, a mix of suspicion and intrigue crossing his features. How do you know that? Victoria didn't flinch. She leaned into the lie, utilizing her unparalleled ability to absorb and synthesize data. She had spent the last 3 days watching him work, categorizing his methods, cross-referencing the technical manuals she had found in the office. Her voice was calm, authoritative. I read the Chilton manual on my break, and I've been watching your solvent rotations. You're bottlenecked. You need someone to prep the auxiliary engines while you do the precision work. Jackson stared at her, the heavy silence hanging between them. He was evaluating her, searching for the hidden agenda. He saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the undeniable competence she had shown in organizing his chaotic inventory. He stepped closer, his physical proximity demanding absolute honesty. I can't pay you what you're used to, Claire, whatever that is. Victoria held her ground, looking directly into the face of a man who measured worth in calluses and sweat. Her response was quiet, stripping away the final layers of her corporate armor. Sometimes the biggest door in a lifetime opens not from a billion-dollar master plan, but from a wrench of the exact right size. I'm not asking for money, I'm asking to finish the job. Jackson held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. He saw the fractures in her facade, the desperate need for an anchor. He didn't know who she was running from, but he knew the look of someone who had survived a crash and was terrified of walking away from the wreckage. He finally nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. He reached out and grabbed a heavy, forged steel crescent wrench from his belt, holding it out to her. His voice was a deep rumble of acceptance. "Be here at 6 a.m. We have a transmission to drop." The underbelly of the Flathead Ford was a claustrophobic cavern of oxidized iron, brittle rubber, and decades of accumulated road grime. Victoria lay flat on the hard plastic of the mechanic's creeper, the heavy forged steel crescent wrench biting fiercely into her blistered palms. Above her, the rusted transmission casing hovered, 100 pounds of dead metal suspended by a single straining hydraulic jack and 3 stubborn bolts that refused to yield. The air down here was thick, tasting of copper and stale gasoline. Jackson's heavy steel-toed boots shifted on the cracked concrete mere inches from her shoulder. His massive frame slid under the chassis beside her, blocking out the harsh glare of the halogen shop lights. The proximity was immediate, overwhelming in the confined space. He reached up, his calloused hands enveloping hers over the handle of the wrench, his skin radiating a dry, furnace-like heat. His chest rumbled against her shoulder, the vibration traveling straight into her bones. "You're fighting the thread, not the rust. Let the leverage do the work. Pull when I push." They moved in tandem, a sudden violent torque that broke the chemical seal of the rust. The bolt shrieked, a high-pitched metallic groan that echoed through the empty bay and gave way. Victoria exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her muscles trembling from the sudden release of tension. The physical reality of the labor was a brutal, unforgiving anchor, dragging her racing mind out of the corporate stratosphere and slamming it directly into the grease-stained present. The heavy transmission dropped a fraction of an inch onto the jack plate with a solid, definitive thud. A sharp rap on the aluminum siding of the open garage door shattered the momentary victory. A man in a cheap poly-blend suit stood in the threshold, the relentless Carolina humidity already wilting his collar. He held a thick manila envelope bearing the embossed gold seal of the Blue Ridge Community Bank. He did not step inside, hovering on the edge of the shadow as if the grime of the shop might leap onto his slacks. Jackson rolled out from under the truck in one fluid, powerful motion. He stood up to his full, towering height, wiping the black grease from his knuckles with deliberate slowness. The easy, focused rhythm of the mechanic vanished, replaced instantly by the rigid, defensive posture of a man backing toward a cliff edge. The bank courier cleared his throat, holding the envelope out like a shield. "Mr. Hayes, final notice on the commercial property loan. The grace period expired at midnight. The regional manager needs a signature acknowledging receipt, or we initiate the foreclosure protocol on Monday." Victoria lay perfectly still on the creeper, hidden in the shadows of the chassis, watching the exchange. In Austin, she orchestrated hostile takeovers that liquidated thousands of jobs with the stroke of a digital pen. Debt was a weapon she wielded with surgical precision. But here, seeing the weapon pointed at the man who had given her shelter, the concept of financial leverage felt obscene, ugly, and viscerally violent. Jackson did not flinch. He took the envelope, signing the attached clipboard with a heavy, illegible scrawl. He handed the board back, his eyes dead and flat. "Tell the regional manager I read my mail. He'll get his money." The courier practically sprinted back to his idling sedan. Jackson stared at the sealed envelope for a long, terrible moment before tossing it onto the workbench. It landed next to a scattered pile of spark plugs, a white flag surrendering to the inevitable. He turned back to the Ford, his jaw locked, picking up a pneumatic drill. The deafening roar of the air compressor masked the heavy, suffocating silence that had fallen over the shop. That night, the oppressive humidity broke into a violent, localized thunderstorm. Victoria sat on the edge of the worn leather sofa in the back office, the rhythmic drumming of rain against the corrugated tin roof, a harsh counterpoint to her racing pulse. Jackson had gone upstairs to the small apartment above the garage, carrying a sleeping Chloe over his shoulder. The shop was pitch black, save for the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp filtering through the frosted glass. Victoria slipped off the sofa, moving silently across the concrete floor to the battered computer terminal sitting on Chloe's desk. The machine was an ancient relic, a beige plastic monstrosity running a terrifyingly outdated operating system. She hit the power button. The hard drive clicked and whirred, protesting the intrusion, before the CRT monitor flared to life, casting a pale, ghostly luminescence across her face. She opened the primitive web browser, her fingers flying across the sticky, crumb-filled keyboard. She bypassed the standard search engines, navigating through a series of encrypted proxy servers she had established years ago for off-grid auditing. She accessed the secure terminal of the global financial wire, the data loaded with agonizing slowness, rendering line by pixelated line. Hartley Dynamics SEC filing, Emergency Board Resolution. Subject: Temporary transfer of executive authority to Harrison Vance. Status: pending shareholder ratification. Her breath hitched. Harrison wasn't just locking her out, he was dismantling her empire from the inside. He was preparing a fire sale of her most advanced predictive modeling divisions, the very soul of the company, to a defense contractor she had spent 2 years fighting off. He was using her engineered disappearance to stage a bloodless coup. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. With 3 lines of root access code, she could trigger a catastrophic security lockdown in the Austin servers, paralyzing Harrison's access and freezing the board's vote. She could burn the bridge while he was standing on it. A small, warm hand rested lightly on her forearm. Victoria violently recoiled, the metal rolling chair squealing against the concrete. Chloe stood beside her in a faded, oversized t-shirt, clutching a frayed stuffed rabbit. The child's eyes reflected the harsh blue light of the monitor. She stared at the cascading lines of complex market data, the blinking cursors, and the severe, predatory expression on Victoria's face. The child's voice was a soft, conspiratorial whisper over the thunder. "Are the bad guys trying to break into the castle?" Victoria stared at the 7-year-old, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The lie she had planted days ago had grown deep, tangled roots. She looked back at the screen, at the billions of dollars hanging in the digital ether, and then at the little girl who believed she was a hero holding the line against the dark. Her throat tightened, a painful knot of guilt and raw affection. "Yes, they're trying to pick the locks, but I'm changing the combinations." Chloe nodded solemnly, leaning her head against Victoria's arm. "My dad says some things are too broken to fix, but I think you just have to know which pieces go where. You're good at putting the pieces back." The innocent observation struck her with the force of a physical blow. Victoria reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and closed the browser window. The screen went black, cutting off the Austin servers, leaving only the reflection of the 2 of them in the curved glass. She was walking a tightrope over an abyss, holding a child's hand for balance. By the end of the first week, the grueling physical labor had fundamentally altered Victoria's biology. The designer riding jacket remained hung on a rusty nail. She wore an oversized, oil-stained flannel shirt borrowed from the lost and found bin. The soft manicured skin of her hands was gone, replaced by cracked knuckles, calluses, and half-moons of permanent grease under her fingernails. They were bleeding the brake lines on an ancient, massive Peterbilt logging truck. The vehicle took up an entire bay, a hulking beast of yellow metal and diesel fumes. Victoria was positioned in the cramped wheel well, a clear plastic tube routed into a discarded water bottle, holding a small wrench to the bleeder valve. Jackson sat in the high driver's cab, his boots resting heavily on the air brake pedal. His deep voice echoed down through the open window, authoritative and steady. "Pump it 3 times and hold. Tell me when the fluid runs clear of bubbles. Don't let air suck back into the caliper." Victoria pumped the stiff lever, her bicep burning with the exertion. She watched the dark, sludgy fluid push through the transparent tubing. A cluster of tiny, champagne-like bubbles followed. She shouted back over the ambient noise of the street. "Still got cavitation in the line! Keep pressure!" A sharp, barking laugh echoed from the cab. Jackson climbed down the aluminum steps, wiping his hands, a rare, genuine smile breaking the severe lines of his face. He walked over, crouching beside her in the cramped wheel well, close enough that she could smell the cedar shavings and ozone that seemed permanently etched into his skin. His dark eyes held a glimmer of profound respect. "Cavitation. You read the heavy machinery manual last night, didn't you? Most of the guys I hire just say it's making the fizzy water." Victoria felt a sudden, unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest, entirely unrelated to the Carolina heat. In the corporate world, praise was transactional, a currency used to manipulate behavior. Jackson's respect was earned in blood, sweat, and stripped bolts. It was the purest validation she had ever received. She leaned her head back against the massive rubber tire, meeting his gaze. "I don't like not knowing how the systems around me operate. Ignorance is a vulnerability." Jackson's smile faded, replaced by a quiet, piercing intensity. He reached out, his rough thumb brushing a streak of black grease from her cheekbone. The touch was electric, a sudden crossing of a boundary that left the air completely devoid of oxygen. His voice dropped, an intimate rumble beneath the noise of the traffic outside. "You spend a lot of time mapping out vulnerabilities, Claire. Must be exhausting, wearing armor 24 hours a day." The urge to shatter the lie tore at her throat. She wanted to tell him her real name. She wanted to tell him that she owned the satellites orbiting above their heads. She wanted to strip away the falsehood and stand before him completely exposed. A heavy diesel horn blasted from Lexington Avenue, shattering the fragile intimacy. Jackson pulled his hand back, the heavy veil of his stoicism falling back into place. He stood up, clearing his throat. The moment was gone, buried under the immediate demands of the shop, but the atmospheric pressure between them had permanently shifted. The danger of her deception was no longer just about Harrison finding her. It was about destroying the only real connection she had forged in a decade. On the 9th day, the sky bruised a violent purple, signaling a severe squall. The wind howled down the valley, violently rattling the aluminum bay doors. Victoria was meticulously logging the serial numbers of a newly delivered crate of alternators into a ledger, her handwriting sharp and precise. Jackson was under the hood of a sleek modern sedan diagnosing an electrical fault. A black, late-model SUV rolled slowly past the open bay doors, its heavily tinted windows rolled up tight against the approaching rain. It crept to the end of the block, executed a sharp, illegal U-turn, and parked directly across the street, half-mounted on the crumbling sidewalk. Victoria's blood turned to ice water. The vehicle screamed corporate security. It was a predator in a jungle of beat-up pickup trucks and rusted sedans. She dropped the pen, shrinking back into the shadows behind a stack of Goodyear tires. The driver's side window of the SUV lowered exactly 2 inches. The dark, cylindrical snout of a telephoto camera lens slid through the gap, pointing directly into the brightly lit cavern of Jackson's garage. Harrison's hounds had picked up the scent. Jackson stood up from the engine block, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. He caught the reflection of the camera lens in the chrome bumper of the sedan. His entire posture transformed instantly. The quiet, methodical mechanic vanished. In his place stood a man violently territorial, a father whose sanctuary was being breached. He did not look toward Victoria. He assumed the lens was aimed at Chloe, who was playing hopscotch on the concrete apron just inside the bay door. In a town like this, strangers taking pictures of children triggered a primal, dangerous response. Jackson reached beneath the workbench, his massive hand closing around the handle of a pneumatic tire bead seater, a heavy steel cylinder designed to hold 10 gallons of highly compressed air, ending in a flattened duckbill nozzle. It was a tool used to blast stubborn tractor tires onto their rims with explosive force. He disconnected the air hose, the cylinder fully charged. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate slowness out into the driving rain, crossing the street toward the idling SUV. Victoria watched, paralyzed by conflicting terrors. If the investigator recognized Jackson confronting him, her cover was blown. But if Jackson engaged violently, he could be arrested, his business shuttered, his daughter put in the system. The investigator in the SUV realized his peril too late. The engine revved, tires spinning uselessly on the wet, mud-slicked asphalt. Jackson reached the driver's side window. He didn't shout. He didn't issue a threat. He simply jammed the flattened nozzle of the steel tank directly into the 2-inch gap of the window and hit the butterfly release valve. The sound was a deafening, concussive boom, louder than a shotgun blast. 10 gallons of compressed air mixed with residual white tire talc exploded into the sealed cabin of the SUV. The heavy vehicle physically rocked on its suspension. The investigator shrieked, blinded by the sudden blizzard of white powder and deafened by the acoustic shockwave. The SUV violently lurched forward, blowing through a red light at the intersection, swerving erratically before disappearing down the mountain road, trailing a cloud of white dust. Jackson stood in the middle of the rain-swept street, the empty steel cylinder hanging loosely from his grip. The water sheeted off his broad shoulders. He walked slowly back into the bay, tossing the tank onto a pile of rags. His knuckles were white, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He looked at Victoria, his eyes burning with a dark, protective fury. Creeps come around here sometimes looking for easy marks. They don't come back twice. Victoria leaned heavily against the tires, her knees trembling so violently she thought she might collapse. A lie told to protect someone is still a blade. It just cuts the one holding it first. Jackson had just assaulted a corporate investigator to protect his daughter, entirely unaware he was actually protecting a billionaire hiding from her own board of directors. The collateral damage of her deception was expanding, threatening to drag this innocent man into the crosshairs of a ruthless legal machine. She had to leave, before Harrison sent a team instead of a scout, before the bank took Jackson's livelihood. But the snare of her own making tightened on the afternoon of the 14th day. The brutal Carolina sun baked the asphalt, waves of heat shimmering off the hoods of the cars in the lot. Jackson was on a ladder, fighting a rusted pulley system on the main overhead door. Victoria was deep in the office, using the ancient computer to quietly reroute a fraction of her secure emergency funds into an untraceable cashier's check, planning to leave it in Jackson's ledger to clear his banknote before she vanished into the night. The smooth, purring engine of a brand-new Mercedes S-Class cut through the mechanical noise of the street. The luxury vehicle parked directly in the center of the driveway, blocking a customer's logging truck. The door opened and a man stepped out. He wore a sharply tailored slate-gray Italian suit entirely incongruous with the grease and grit of the surroundings. He carried a sleek, brushed aluminum briefcase. He was a high-end commercial real estate broker, a vulture circling distressed properties. Jackson climbed down the ladder slowly, wiping a smear of black grease from his brow. He didn't offer his hand. "You're blocking the bay. Move the car." The broker smiled, a razor-thin expression devoid of warmth. He clicked open his briefcase, extracting a thick sheaf of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. "Mr. Hayes, I represent a development consortium out of Charlotte. We recently acquired your commercial debt portfolio from Blue Ridge Community Trust. As of this morning, we are the primary lien holders on this property." Jackson froze, the heavy wrench in his hand suddenly looking like a toy against the crushing weight of institutional power. The bank hadn't foreclosed, they had sold his debt to sharks. The broker stepped carefully around a puddle of oil. You are 60 days in arrears. My clients have zero interest in operating a failing garage. The land, however, is zoned for luxury condominiums. I have a buyout offer here. It clears your debt, leaves you with $5,000 relocation money, and requires you to vacate the premises within 72 hours. If you refuse, we lock the gates tomorrow morning and seize your remaining inventory. Victoria stood in the doorway of the frosted glass office, her blood turning to liquid nitrogen. She recognized the predatory tactic. It was a classic aggressive acquisition squeeze. The broker wasn't negotiating, he was executing an execution. She stepped out of the office, her corporate instincts violently overriding her cover story. She marched toward the broker, her voice slicing through the heavy, humid air with absolute, terrifying authority. The foreclosure protocol in Buncombe County requires a mandatory 30-day notice of intent to seize after a portfolio transfer. Your 72-hour ultimatum is a violation of state commercial code, rendering this entire buyout offer predatory and legally void. You lock those gates tomorrow and you'll be buried in a tortious interference lawsuit before your clients can pour the first yard of concrete. The silence that slammed down on the garage was absolute. The background noise of the street seemed to vanish. Jackson stared at Victoria, completely paralyzed. The woman who had been scrubbing grease from his floors for 2 weeks had just eviscerated a high-powered corporate lawyer with the cold, lethal precision of an apex predator. The vocabulary, the posture, the absolute absence of fear. It was a terrifying metamorphosis. The broker blinked, entirely taken aback by the sudden verbal assault from a woman wearing an oil-stained flannel shirt. His eyes narrowed, assessing her face. He tilted his head, a spark of recognition flashing in his cold eyes. He looked from Victoria to his aluminum briefcase, his mind racing. He reached inside, bypassing the legal documents, and pulled out a glossy, high-end financial magazine he kept for client meetings. The cover featured a high-resolution, stylized portrait of a woman standing in front of a massive wall of digital data. The headline screamed in bold silver letters, "The Data Queen, How Victoria Vance Controls the Invisible Market." The broker looked at the magazine, then up at Victoria. He let out a low, breathy chuckle of pure disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," the broker whispered, holding the magazine up so the glossy cover caught the sunlight. He looked at Jackson, a smirk twisting his face. "You holding out on me, Hayes? You didn't tell me your floor sweeper was worth $3 billion. Jackson didn't move. He didn't breathe. His dark eyes locked onto the cover of the magazine. The woman staring back at him was dressed in slate-gray armor, her eyes cold, calculating, and ruthless. It was the exact same face, the exact same piercing gaze of the woman standing 3 feet away from him. The broker tossed the legal folder onto the hood of a rusted car. "Tell you what, Mr. Hayes, why don't you ask your apprentice here to write a check out of her petty cash to cover your mortgage? Consider the buyout offer rescinded. We'll proceed with the hostile seizure tomorrow. Have a pleasant afternoon." The Mercedes purred to life and backed out into the street, leaving behind a devastating, suffocating silence. Victoria stood frozen, her heart detonating in her chest. The magazine lay on the hood of the car, a glossy, undeniable testament to her deception. The castle walls had collapsed. The spy game was over. She took a hesitant, trembling step toward Jackson. "Jackson, please, let me explain." Jackson slowly turned his head to look at her. The warmth, the respect, the quiet vulnerability he had shown her over the past 14 days was entirely gone. His eyes were flat, dark, and terrifyingly empty. He looked at her as if she were a toxic spill on his garage floor. He walked over to the car, picking up the magazine by the corner. He looked at the cover, then looked at the cracked, bleeding calluses on Victoria's hands. His voice was a low, vibrating growl, infinitely worse than shouting. "Victoria Vance, CEO." The words felt like a physical assault. Victoria swallowed the bile rising in her throat. The name on the magazine isn't who I am. The woman who helped you drop that transmission. That's who I wanted to be. I was running from them, from all of it. Jackson dropped the magazine onto the dirt floor. Men who measure their worth in polished leather rarely understand those who measure it in calluses. He took a step forward, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over her. Poverty is not a costume you can unzip when the novelty wears off, he said, his voice cracking with a profound, agonizing betrayal. You came in here playing poor. You watched me tear my hands apart trying to keep a roof over my daughter's head, knowing you had a satellite on your wrist that could buy this whole mountain. You let my kid think you were a hero hiding from bad guys when you're the one running the game. I didn't plan this, Victoria pleaded, tears cutting hot, stinging tracks through the grease on her face. My accounts were frozen. I was trapped. But then, I stayed because of you, because of Chloe, because this shop is the only real thing I've touched in a decade. I can fix this. I can pay the bank. I can save the shop. Jackson's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against his skin. The offer of money was the final, unforgivable insult. It reduced everything they had shared, the sweat, the long hours, the quiet moments of connection, to a financial transaction. He pointed a massive, trembling finger toward the open bay doors, toward the brutal heat of the street. You can't buy respect with a black card, but you can certainly bankrupt a soul with one. Jackson's voice was a devastating, hollow echo. I don't want your money. I don't want your charity. I want you off my property. Victoria stood paralyzed, the absolute finality of his words crushing the breath from her lungs. She had navigated corporate bloodbaths and destroyed rival executives without a second thought. But standing in this humid, oil-stained garage, facing the rejection of a man who owned nothing but his pride, she was completely, utterly destroyed. The heaviest things we carry aren't made of steel, but of the truths we refuse to speak. She turned away, not bothering to collect the designer jacket still hanging on the rusty nail. She walked out of the shadow of the garage and into the blinding, unforgiving glare of the Carolina sun. The Indian Scout remained inside, its engine fully repaired, but she did not look back. She walked down Lexington Avenue, a billionaire with grease under her fingernails, entirely alone in a world she could buy but no longer belonged to. The air conditioning in the 38th floor boardroom hummed, a sterile, synthesized breeze that smelled of recycled ozone and exorbitant wealth. 31 days had passed since the brutal Carolina sun had scorched the back of Victoria's neck. The calluses on her palms, earned through sweat and iron, were already fading, replaced by the smooth, unblemished skin of a woman who manipulated the world without ever actually touching it. She sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, an immovable monolith of tailored silk and absolute authority. Harrison paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, projecting a holographic financial model into the center of the room. He was in his element, dissecting the impending merger with the defense contractor, outlining the systematic dismantling of her predictive modeling divisions. The board of directors listened in rapt, predatory silence, their eyes reflecting the glowing green numbers of projected quarterly growth. Victoria stared at the digital rendering of her empire being sold for scrap. The phantom ache of a heavy wrench biting into her blistered hands pulsed in her memory, a visceral reminder of what real gravity felt like. She stood up. The movement was slow, fluid, and completely unscripted. Harrison paused his presentation, a patronizing smile touching the corners of his mouth. Do we have a strategic pivot, Victoria? The acquisition timeline is already locked down for the morning bell. She did not look at him. She withdrew a sleek encrypted hard drive from the interior pocket of her blazer and dropped it onto the polished mahogany. It hit the wood with a heavy, definitive thud that echoed louder than the city traffic below. Her voice was a razor dragged across glass. That drive contains untampered internal audits. It details the predatory algorithmic lending practices you authorized in the housing sector, the shell companies used to hide the losses, and the deliberate manipulation of user data to inflate our valuation before this merger. It was transmitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and 3 major investigative news outlets exactly 5 minutes ago. The color vanished from Harrison's face, leaving him a sickly waxen gray. The board members erupted into immediate chaotic panic, reaching for phones, shouting over one another. "You're detonating the stock!" Harrison's voice cracked, the composed executive mask shattering into pure, unadulterated terror. "You'll be investigated too. The board will strip you of everything. You're burying yourself just to kill the deal." Victoria buttoned her blazer, her posture utterly rigid, completely detached from the multi-billion-dollar inferno she had just ignited. "A fortress built on lies will eventually crush the person it was designed to protect," she replied, the absolute certainty in her tone slicing through the boardroom hysteria. "I am stepping down as Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. Try not to bleed on the carpet when the federal marshals arrive." She walked out of the glass tower, leaving the ruins of her former life burning behind her. The elevator descent felt less like a fall and more like the violent decompression of surfacing from the bottom of the ocean. She was free. But the freedom tasted like ash. 1,000 miles away, the Appalachian autumn had surrendered to a brutal, unforgiving winter. The Blue Ridge Mountains were encased in a jagged armor of gray ice and bare, skeletal trees. Inside the garage on Lexington Avenue, the biting wind howled through the gaps in the corrugated siding, stealing the heat from the single kerosene space heater. Jackson lay on a sheet of frozen cardboard beneath the undercarriage of a municipal snowplow. He was replacing a sheared hydraulic line, his breath pluming in thick white clouds. The shop belonged to him entirely now. He had saved the property from the real estate developers, not with a magical corporate bailout, but by liquidating his entire meager retirement fund and selling the immaculate candy apple red vintage motorcycle he had spent 3 years restoring. He had traded his safety net and his masterpiece for the deed to the dirt beneath his boots. He tightened the brass fitting, his muscles screaming in protest. The physical exhaustion was a necessary anesthetic. If he stopped moving, if the mechanical noise faded, the crushing silence of the garage would allow the memory of the woman in the oversized flannel shirt to return. He could not afford the luxury of that specific grief. A sudden, sharp scream shattered the rhythmic clanking of his tools. It came from the apartment upstairs. Jackson scrambled out from under the plow, his heart seizing with an ancient, familiar terror. He sprinted up the narrow wooden staircase, taking the steps 3 at a time, tearing the door off its rusted hinges in his haste. Chloe lay curled on the braided rug of the living room, clutching her abdomen, her small body convulsing with agonizing pain. Her skin was a terrifying translucent shade of gray, completely slick with a feverish sweat. Jackson dropped to his knees, scooping the 7-year-old into his massive arms. The heat radiating from her skin was alarming, a raging internal fire. "Daddy, it hurts so bad." Her voice was a thin, ragged whimper, barely audible over the rattling window panes. He didn't waste time calling an ambulance he knew would take 30 minutes to navigate the iced-over mountain roads. He wrapped her in a heavy quilt, carried her down to his battered pickup truck, and threw the vehicle into gear, the tires spinning violently against the black ice before catching traction. The rural county clinic was a chaotic, underfunded triage center, fighting a losing battle against the impending storm. The fluorescent lights flickered violently as the mountain winds battered the regional power grid. The attending physician, a haggard man running on entirely too much caffeine and too little sleep, pulled Jackson into the sterile, linoleum-tiled hallway outside the examination room. "It's acute appendicitis and it's already ruptured," the doctor said, his voice flat with grim urgency. "She's in septic shock. The infection is aggressively attacking her bloodstream. We need to operate immediately to flush the abdominal cavity, but her blood pressure is crashing. We need O-negative whole blood to stabilize her through the surgery, and our fridge is empty." Jackson's hands shook, a massive oak tree trembling in a hurricane. "So order it. Get it from the city." The doctor looked toward the frosted window at the end of the hall. The world outside had vanished into a blinding horizontal whiteout, a freak blizzard the worst the region had seen in a century, had descended with terrifying speed. "The regional blood bank is in Charlotte, 70 miles away," the doctor explained, rubbing his temples. "The interstate is completely buried. State police just closed the mountain pass. Highway patrol is grounded. Life flight helicopters cannot navigate zero visibility blizzard conditions. We are entirely cut off." The words were a death sentence. Jackson stood in the flickering light, the invincible mechanic who could rebuild any engine, completely powerless to fix the only thing that mattered. He collapsed into a plastic waiting room chair, burying his face in his calloused hands, the absolute despair finally breaking him. Back in Austin, the relentless purge of the corporate ecosystem was underway. Victoria sat in the private lounge of a chartered aviation terminal, waiting for the final clearance to relocate her remaining personal assets to a decentralized trust. The television mounted above the bar flashed breaking news banners detailing the catastrophic collapse of Hartley Dynamics' stock price. Her encrypted satellite phone, a replacement she had procured the day she returned, vibrated violently against the marble tabletop. It was an unknown number, routed through a North Carolina area code. She answered, the lingering paranoia of the federal investigation making her cautious. "Listen to me, you corporate ice queen," a woman's voice snapped, trembling with suppressed hysteria. It was Darlene, the owner of the deli down the street from the garage. "I don't care about your billion-dollar magazines or whatever games you were playing in this town. Chloe is dying. Her appendix burst. The clinic is snowed in, they have no blood, and Jackson is sitting in the hallway looking like a ghost. You owe that little girl. Do something." The line went dead. Victoria stared at the phone, the blood rushing in her ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the terminal. The walls of the glass mountain she had just descended suddenly materialized around her again, threatening to suffocate her. She turned to the private charter coordinator standing at the desk. "I need a Gulfstream fueled and ready for de-icing in 5 minutes," Victoria commanded, her voice vibrating with a terrifying absolute authority. "Filing a flight plan for Asheville Regional. Tell the pilot I am authorizing a triple hazard weather bonus. We are flying directly into the blizzard." The descent into the Blue Ridge Mountains was an aviation nightmare. The private jet was violently tossed through the atmospheric meat grinder, the turbulence threatening to shear the wings from the fuselage. Victoria sat strapped into the leather seat, her knuckles white, her mind frantically running logistical algorithms, calculating fuel weights, ground transport vectors, and medical supply chain bypasses. They landed on a runway buried under 3 inches of fresh powder, the thrust reversers screaming in protest as the aircraft skidded to a terrifying sideways halt. Victoria bypassed the terminal entirely. She commandeered a heavy-duty chain tire utility vehicle from the airfield maintenance crew with a ruthless combination of intimidation and promises of exorbitant compensation. She drove the massive 4x4 like a weapon, smashing through snowdrifts and sliding blindly around the treacherous switchbacks of the mountain pass. The blizzard was a solid wall of white, erasing the world beyond the hood of the truck. She slammed the vehicle into park outside the rural clinic, leaving the engine running, and sprinted through the double doors. The waiting room was a tableau of despair. Jackson sat hunched in the plastic chair, a hollow, defeated shell of the towering man she knew. He did not look up as she approached. He was entirely consumed by the impending void. Victoria bypassed him, marching directly to the triage desk. The exhausted doctor was arguing frantically into a landline telephone, trying to coordinate a National Guard snowcat that was currently stuck in a ditch 40 miles away. Victoria slammed her platinum identification card onto the counter. "I need the exact coordinates of the Charlotte blood bank and the name of the director," she demanded, projecting the ruthless CEO persona to cut through the bureaucratic panic. "I will charter a private military-grade Sikorsky helicopter from the nearest Air Force base. I don't care what the weather minimums are. I will buy the aircraft and indemnify the pilot personally. Put me on the phone with the flight dispatcher." The doctor blinked, utterly bewildered by the sudden intrusion of this force of nature. He handed her the receiver. Victoria dialed the emergency charter hotline she kept for executive extractions. The automated voice routing system clicked over to a live operator. "This is Victoria Vance. Account authorization Alpha 97. I need immediate rotary wing extraction capabilities in severe blizzard conditions. Routing Charlotte to Asheville. Bill the emergency retainer." The operator paused. The sound of rapid keyboard typing echoed over the line. "Ms. Vance, I'm sorry, I cannot process this request." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Override the weather protocol. I will authorize a $10 million hazard escrow. Do it now." "It isn't the weather, ma'am." The operator's voice was tense, apologetic. "Your authorization code is invalid. All financial accounts, trusts, and corporate escrows tied to your primary Social Security number have been placed under a Class A federal freeze by the Securities and Exchange Commission, pending the ongoing fraud investigation. Your assets are locked. The system won't even let me process a $1 transaction." "I'm so sorry." The line disconnected. Victoria stood at the triage desk, the plastic receiver slowly slipping from her grip. The bomb she had detonated in Austin to clear her conscience had generated a shockwave that reached all the way to this frozen mountain. By choosing to do the right thing, by burning her corrupt empire to the ground, she had triggered the automatic federal asset freeze. She had stripped herself of the very power she now desperately needed to save the child's life. She turned around. Jackson was standing directly behind her. He had heard the entire exchange. He saw the absolute crushing realization in her eyes. The ultimate failure of wealth. You can spend your whole life climbing a glass mountain, only to realize the air at the top is too thin to breathe. Her billions locked behind federal firewalls were utterly useless against the brutal reality of nature and biology. Victoria's voice broke, a ragged, devastated whisper. "I can't buy the chopper. They locked the accounts, Jackson. I burned it all down, and now I have nothing left to help her." Jackson looked at the woman who had lied to him, the billionaire who had played in his garage, now standing before him completely stripped of her armor, crying tears of profound, helpless grief. He saw the truth in her asset freeze. She hadn't just walked away from her power. She had destroyed it. He reached out, his massive calloused hands gripping her shoulders, anchoring her to the linoleum floor. "You can't buy a miracle today, Victoria." Jackson's voice was a low, steady rumble, devoid of anger, entirely focused. "But you aren't the only one who knows how to build a system." He turned away from the triage desk, striding purposefully toward the exit doors. He pushed through the glass, stepping out into the raging blizzard, moving toward the idling utility truck Victoria had abandoned. He didn't grab the keys. He reached through the open window and ripped the heavy-duty CB radio microphone from the dashboard mount. He depressed the transmission button, his voice cutting through the static interference, broadcasting on the universal emergency channel used by every commercial driver navigating the treacherous Appalachian routes. "Breaker 19, this is Jackson Custom out of Asheville. I have a code red emergency at the county clinic. My little girl is bleeding out on an operating table. We need O-negative blood from the central bank in Charlotte, and the state police have surrendered to the snow. I need a path broken through the pass. I am calling in every marker, every free repair, every roadside rescue I have ever performed in 15 years. I need heavy iron on the mountain right now." He released the button. The radio hissed with white noise. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was only the sound of the howling wind. Then the radio crackled. "Jackson Custom, this is Big Bear hauling timber out of Marion. I've got 50,000 pounds of weight over my drive axles and chain tires. I'm 10 miles from the Charlotte Bank. I'll pick up the cooler and point my nose up the mountain. Who's breaking the trail?" Another voice, heavily accented and gruff, cut through the static. "This is the municipal plow crew out of Black Mountain. We remember who fixed our hydraulics on Christmas Eve for free, Jackson. We're diverting 3 wedge plows to the interstate access ramp. We'll cut the ice." The radio exploded into a chaotic symphony of voices. Independent owner-operators, commercial fleet drivers, local tow truck dispatchers, men who measured their worth in calluses and diesel smoke, responding to a call from one of their own. The true currency of a man isn't stored in a vault. It's measured by the number of hands that reach into the dark to pull him back to the light. Jackson stood in the snow, the radio mic in his hand, tears mixing with the freezing precipitation on his cheeks. He looked back through the glass doors of the clinic. Victoria was watching him, her eyes wide with absolute staggering awe. Over the next 2 hours, the impossible geometry of community logistics unfolded on the mountain. 3 massive steel-bladed snowplows ran in a staggered V formation, violently throwing walls of packed ice off the treacherous switchbacks. Behind them, a convoy of heavily chained logging trucks provided an unstoppable drafting shield against the crosswinds. Tucked safely in the center of the mechanical phalanx was the timber hauler, carrying a styrofoam cooler packed with dry ice and 6 units of life-saving O-negative blood. The state police, realizing they could not stop the convoy, joined it, providing flashing lights and intersection clearance. The massive timber rig rolled into the clinic parking lot, its grille encased in solid ice, the diesel engine roaring like a triumphant beast. The driver jumped from the cab, sprinting through the blizzard with the red cooler clutched to his chest. Jackson met him at the doors, taking the cooler with trembling hands, passing it instantly to the surgical nurses waiting in the hallway. The operating room doors swung shut. The red surgical light flared to life. The storm raged outside, but inside the waiting room, the immediate crisis had passed into the hands of the surgeons. Jackson sank back into the plastic chair, his massive frame vibrating with the adrenaline crash. Victoria sat down slowly beside him. She did not speak. She simply existed in the space next to him, a silent anchor in the sterile hallway. Hours bled into the deep frozen night. The surgical doors finally opened. The haggard doctor emerged, pulling down his surgical mask, a weary, profound relief etched into his features. "We stopped the sepsis," the doctor said quietly. "The transfusion stabilized her blood pressure. We removed the ruptured tissue and flushed the cavity. She's heavily sedated, but her vitals are strong. She's going to make it, Jackson." Jackson exhaled, a sound that seemed to empty his lungs of decades of accumulated grief and terror. He leaned his head back against the cinder block wall, closing his eyes. Victoria stood up, stepping quietly away to give the father his space. She walked down the hallway, stopping at the small frosted window, looking out at the massive logging trucks still idling in the parking lot, their drivers drinking terrible clinic coffee from paper cups, waiting to make sure the job was done. She felt a heavy presence behind her. Jackson stood there, his dark eyes studying her profile in the dim emergency lighting. "The operator on the phone," Jackson said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "She said you were under federal investigation, that they locked your accounts." Victoria didn't turn around. She kept her gaze fixed on the snowplows. "I initiated the investigation," she confessed, the absolute truth finally leaving her lips without hesitation. "I turned over the encrypted drives detailing the board's financial crimes to the SEC. It triggered an automatic freeze on all executive assets associated with the company. I destroyed the empire, Jackson. I'm not a billionaire hiding in a garage anymore. I'm just an unemployed data analyst waiting for a subpoena. Jackson processed the magnitude of her action. She hadn't just walked away from the power that offended him. She had actively dismantled it, sacrificing her own wealth to stop the predatory machine she had built. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. The anger, the betrayal that had poisoned the air between them a month ago had completely evaporated, burned away by the brutal crucible of the blizzard and the blood. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is drop the crown and pick up the tools, Jackson murmured, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of absolute forgiveness. He reached out, his rough, grease-stained fingers gently wrapping around her wrist, pulling her hand away from the cold glass. He looked at her palm. The designer manicure was long gone. The skin was healing, but the faint, undeniable ridges of newly formed calluses remained, a permanent testament to her time beneath the heavy iron. We don't fix things because they are perfect. We fix them because they are ours. He looked into her eyes, the severe lines of his face softening into an expression of profound, quiet affection. The hospital allows one visitor in the recovery room. She's going to want to know if the spy managed to change the lock combinations in the castle. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The walls of her isolation, constructed over a decade of ruthless corporate warfare, finally shattered, leaving only the overwhelming, terrifying reality of human connection. She nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and followed him down the hall. 6 months later, the Blue Ridge Mountains were alive with the violent, vibrant green of late spring. The heavy garage doors of Jackson Custom were rolled up, inviting the warm, pine-scented breeze into the cavernous bay. The shop had expanded. Jackson had hired 2 new apprentices from the local vocational school, finally delegating the grunt work so he could focus on the complex, holistic mechanical restorations that were his true calling. In the back of the garage, the frosted glass office had been entirely transformed. The ancient beige computer terminal was gone, replaced by a sleek multi-monitor workstation. Victoria sat in the rolling chair, wearing a faded denim shirt, her hair tied up with a clean blue shop rag. She was no longer running a multi-billion-dollar predatory analytics firm. She had leveraged her unmatched understanding of data architecture to open a boutique consulting agency, auditing supply chains for ethical labor practices and environmental compliance. She commanded a fraction of her former wealth, but she owned every single second of her time. Chloe sat at the adjacent desk, her crayons replaced by a tablet sketching a digital blueprint of an impossibly complex treehouse. Jackson walked into the office, wiping his hands on a red rag. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, a genuine, easy smile breaking across his face. "I've got a seized transmission on a 72 Bronco that needs dropping," Jackson announced, tossing the rag onto the desk. "My apprentices are terrified of it. They think the rust is load-bearing." Victoria saved her spreadsheet, closing the laptop with a satisfying click. The corporate world was a ghost, a distant, sterile memory fading into the background of the chaotic, beautiful reality she had chosen. She stood up, walking toward the door, her eyes meeting Jackson's with a shared, silent understanding of exactly what they had built together. She reached out, pulling the heavy, forged steel crescent wrench from the leather loop on his tool belt. The metal was cold, heavy, and absolutely perfect in her grip. "Tell them to step back," she said, her voice steady, carrying the quiet confidence of a woman who finally knew exactly where she belonged. "I'll show them how to break the seal."